Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, May 16th, 2025, and our friend Mark Sleboda is back with us. Welcome back, Mark.
Nima, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Dialogue Works.
Mark, let's talk about what has happened in this meeting in Istanbul between the two delegations. Here is what Stormer said, that if Russia is unwilling to come to the negotiating table, Putin must pay the price. Speaking to POTUS, we are closely aligning our response to Russia's unacceptable position. And what we've learned from the Russian side, they're just talking about who's the stormer in this game.
Yeah. They said unacceptable to whom? We're not negotiating with the United Kingdom. Are you speaking for Kiev, for the collective West? What? I mean, who is Starmer? That was Russia's response. We're not negotiating with the UK. Bug off. Right? is essentially what I mean, not essentially. It's pretty much exactly what the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova said. Unacceptable to who? We're not negotiating with you.
But it doesn't seem
complete.
that in the mind of Europeans that's the case. They're behind the scene running the show in
Of course
Ukraine.
they are. Of course they are. So let's rewind a bit before Istanbul, right? So Trump is making a major, has been making, right, attempting to make a major diplomatic push to settle the conflict in Ukraine on terms that preserve the U.S. proxy regime in Kiev, right? He said that right out. I'm trying to save Ukraine. If you don't do what I'm doing, you're going to lose your whole country, right? He says he's trying to save Ukrainians, right? Obviously not the Ukrainians that are being forcibly conscripted, beat on the streets like dogs, like Putin said, and dragged to the front, but the regime, the U.S. proxy regime. Now, that being said, we know Trump despises Zelensky. He has nothing but contempt for him, right? He mocks him all the time as a beggar and how much money he was able to wheedle out of Biden and so forth. He doesn't like the Maidan regime in general, either prior or before. He sees them correctly as being politically in bed with his domestic political opponents, the Democrats, right? And neocons to a lesser extent in the United States. He doesn't care much for Ukraine, right? He doesn't see it as a critical geopolitical piece on the strategic board. That's not the way Trump thinks, right? Trump, I believe, thinks outside of what we normally think of as geopolitics, right? Which is, what he is. He thinks in terms of business, of trade, right? More business even than trade, perhaps. I don't know if he quite gets geoeconomics or macroeconomics even. And we know that he hates the EU political leaders, right? I mean, again, he sees them as working against him, both during his first administration and during the campaign of siding with his domestic political opponents. And, he just doesn't respect them, right? Orban and a few others, obviously exceptions to that rule. But he's still the U.S. president, right? He's got an enormous apparatus, even within his own administration, right? It's a majority neocons, right? Because there's really not many other people to draw from with policy expertise and positions, right? There's a huge structural impetus forcing him in a direction, and his people are presenting him policy options that continually narrow his options, right? Everyone is trying to manipulate Trump, right? Putin is trying to manipulate Trump. Zelensky is trying to manipulate Trump. All the European leaders are trying to manipulate Trump. Everyone within his own administration is trying to manipulate Trump. Trump is famously susceptible right? To flattery, to suggestion, to plays to his ego, right? And that's the way he likes it, right? He presents himself as the God Emperor of the United States or mankind or whatever, and everyone should come to his court and pay court to him. They should flatter him. They should throw money and gifts and whatnot. And that's just the way it is. So everyone knows on all, or there's two sides to this diplomatic war of maneuver. You can call it a dance. You can call it poker if you want. I don't particularly like that analogy. More, it's a game of hot potato, right? Throwing the potato back and forth, trying to be the last one, or musical chairs if you're less familiar with that. Because both sides, Russia and the Kiev regime and the EU on the other, know that there isn't going to be any diplomatic settlement, right? Not any time in the short to medium term, maybe in the long term, right? But things are not settled, right? People have not accepted that Russia is winning on the battlefield. There is no acceptance of that in Kiev or in Europe, and only partial acceptance of that in the United States in the Trump administration. They agree that Russia's winning, but they still think that they can dictate terms for the diplomatic settlement to Russia, right? We heard Rubio say, or sorry, was it Rubio this week? Oh no, it was actually Vance. Vance said in the last week, Russia is asking for too much. Exactly. So, but everyone knows the diplomatic settlement is going to fail, right? And that Trump's big peace effort, since before he came into office, is going to end up nowhere. And more than likely, he's going to be faced with the choice of either walking away completely or being forced into what I like to call Brandon 2.0, which is a return to the game of sanctioning Russia and providing weapons to the Kiev regime. Maybe he'll get the Europeans to pay for those weapons, but it will still be the U.S. providing weapons to the Kiev regime. So that's the most likely outcome of all of this. But the game is, when this diplomatic settlement fails, for the other side to take the blame for why it failed. To a lesser degree, right, in global public diplomacy, right, the background, right, to countries like Brazil and India and so forth that care about the diplomatic negotiations and at least the going through the form of trying to seek peace, particularly for Russia, the BRICS countries, not China, they're completely on board, that's not a question. But for Brazil, India, maybe even South Africa, it's important to go through these niceties. So that's part of where the battlefield is. But the majority of this battlefield, this diplomatic war of maneuver, is in Trump's febrile little brain, right? Because Trump, first of all, has the ability to support Ukraine. And from the Russian perspective, if they could convince Trump to walk away, or at least to keep the level of support to the low level it is now, that means that Russia's job would, they're reaching the goals of their SMO, whether that's as strictly interpreted or ultimately must be regime change in Kiev, which is what I believe. It will go faster. It will happen quicker. And the cost to Russia will be less. They would still win, right? Quite obviously, they were still winning when Joe Biden was throwing everything in the kitchen sink at Kiev, right? Doing everything. But it would cost them more and it would take longer time. So Russia's willing to play this game right now, right? Because they know that Trump is susceptible, right? He is suggestive. The odds are against them, again, because the entire U.S. establishment behind Trump, all of Europe, U.S.'s allies, are pushing him in the other direction. But they're willing to engage in this, right? This game of who takes the blame for when the whole diplomatic process fails definitively. Now, Trump has been pushing two big things in the last few weeks, right? One, he bought onto the European, and you want to call it the Kellogg plan, demand for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, right? Now, Russia has been outright, publicly, openly rejecting a ceasefire, no ceasefire for more than a year, right? Last June, Putin presented his terms for a ceasefire, right? Which include many things, but that the Kiev regime withdraws all the troops it has left in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhia, including from Kherson City and Zaporozhia City, big cities themselves, right? Which, of course, they are never going to do, right? Russia has no interest in a ceasefire. They're winning. We've been down this road, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Russia pulling back from Kiev and the Istanbul communique. We've had 3 failed ceasefires. The Trump arranged one over energy infrastructure, the Putin unilaterally declared ceasefire over Easter and over Victory Day, right? And the Kiev regime didn't adhere to any of those. So why should they give them a ceasefire? Russia has recently started demanding that if they were to agree to a ceasefire, the West, all of the West must stop all military aid, weapons supplies and intelligence to the Kiev regime, which of course they're not going to do, right? That's not in the cards. So Russia's basically saying no ceasefire, none, right? The Kiev regime is saying we will only engage in substantive diplomatic talks after the ceasefire is put into effect. Russia is saying the opposite. We will only possibly get to a ceasefire once we begin a diplomatic settlement that will resolve the core issues of why we intervened in this, civil conflict in Ukraine in the first place 3 years ago. Now, historically, the West is trying to present this as, oh, how can there possibly be negotiations without a ceasefire until the firing stops? That is false. It is historically completely inaccurate. Most conflicts are settled, right, where negotiations begin and take place for months, for years, while the conflict ensues. And only at the end, when the agreement is within sight, might you have a ceasefire, the gun ceasefire. Vietnam, the U.S. Defeat and withdrawal from Vietnam. The negotiations took years, right? Korea, similarly. Even Trump's, the first Trump administration's negotiation with the Taliban for the U.S. defeat and withdrawal of their troops from Afghanistan, right? That was negotiated by Trump while conflict raged in Afghanistan, on a much smaller scale, of course, but it certainly didn't stop. So historically, right, that's simply false. So the Europeans don't want a ceasefire, right? They don't want anything that would make any moves towards ending this conflict now, when they would have to accept even a modicum of Russian terms, right? They hope to carry on this conflict for years, when they hope that they will be able to coalesce and completely rebuild a joint military industrial complex, which they're not making any substantive steps on, by the way, at all yet. So that's a pipe dream and a half. And the other hope is that Donald Trump will be gone and we'll have another Democrat, another Biden, or even a neocon in place in the U.S., and it will be back to what it was. They will not accept a defeat to Russia, right? They think they can wait this out. So they want the conflict to continue. They also are threatening, particularly the United Kingdom and France, to put their troops on the ground as soon as a ceasefire comes into effect, right? Troops, they're talking NATO planes over Western Ukraine. They're talking all sorts of things. Now, their own military, the British brass, anonymously to their paper of record, The Telegraph, said this is political theater. They do not have the ability to deter Russia. They do not have the capability for high intensity conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Their militaries have deteriorated far beyond that capability. Right? They're in it. They're not in Russia's weight class. What's more, they argued that they don't even have the capabilities to sustain a even a medium term human tripwire force, right? You want to call them peacekeepers, a reassurance force. They would be a human tripwire force in Western Ukraine. They said they would struggle just to maintain that logistically for a period of time. So how real those threats are, I don't know. It doesn't seem very likely, but it's practically guaranteed that if they keep yelling that, then even if Russia was to consider a ceasefire, which they're not, then that would definitely make them say no, right? If the ceasefire results in what they went to this war to prevent NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, no, of course they're never going to agree to that. So I think that's definitely part of the Europeans' logic at the least. Maybe they're willing to go through with it at the end, but primarily at the moment at least, it's an attempt to make sure that Russia never agrees to a ceasefire, even as they rhetorically, publicly demand that Russia accepts a ceasefire. It's a game, right? It's all about influencing Trump and coming up on his good side in all of this. So that's what they made an ultimatum. They said, late last week, Russia must accept. We demand that Russia accept an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And they even set a clock. They were counting the hours till Monday, that if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire until then they were going to unleash the sanctions cannon on Russia, right? More punitive sanctions, because the first 28,000 sanctions that they put on Russia didn't break, but the next one will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? That's the way they were presenting it. So Putin, seeing this play, right, to paint them as the one who doesn't want peace. And it has to be said, Russia doesn't want peace. Russia wants victory, right? Everyone wants peace on their terms. And everyone doesn't want peace except on their terms, right? That's the goal right now. The U.S. wants peace on terms that they can force on Russia, that they think diplomatically, having failed in the proxy war, right? Everyone wants peace on their terms, right? But no one has been forced to anything yet. So Putin is attempting to turn this ceasefire demand. He just ignores it. He just ignored it, didn't address it at all, and said, he went what the other thing that Trump has been talking about. Trump has also been talking about how Russia and Ukraine need to have direct negotiations, right? He's been hammering that the other thing, other than the ceasefire, for the past few weeks. So he's saying, all right, and Russia has, to fair, that's nothing new. Russia has always been saying that they're willing and they want to return to negotiations with Ukraine, right? Because they prefer to meet their goals diplomatically. But if they can't, then they'll do it militarily. And that it was the Kiev regime that walked away from talks, the Istanbul communique, in 2022. But now Putin, the way he flipped the game, right, or threw it back in their court, was he set a place and a date. He said Istanbul on the 15th, right, on Thursday. We'll send a team and we'll be ready for direct negotiations. Now, it has to be remembered that Zelensky several years ago put up a diktat that no one in Ukraine, no official in Ukraine, is allowed to negotiate with Russia while Vladimir Putin is still president, right? And he then later exempted himself, saying, well, it doesn't include me because I put the diktat, right? So, but obviously that has now either been removed or is now just being carefully ignored or whatever. Initially, when Putin said Istanbul 15th, negotiations be there, Zelensky said no, right? Absolutely not. We're not going there. Then Trump went off on social media and horrified Kiev and the Europeans and said he essentially ordered Ukraine to be there, like in all screaming capital letters, like the seventh grader loose on social media that Trump is, immediately, right? In all capital letters, right? So Zelensky turned, he took his cues, right, as a proxy, on at least good in this regard, and said, fine, but I'll only negotiate with Putin, right? I'll only negotiate with Putin. And first he actually said, only after they agree to a 30-day ceasefire, right? And then that wasn't happening. And then the pressure from Trump continued, and then they gave up on that, right? That happened within 2 days. So they were going to go, but it would only be Zelensky talking with Putin. And the Russians were quiet. They weren't saying anything. They were keeping it close. They were playing it out. And only the day before the 15th did they announce their negotiation team. And it wasn't Putin, and it wasn't even Lavrov or whatever. It was, however, a serious team of professional, expert negotiators, right? In fact, the head of the team, Vladimir Medinsky, was the previous head of the negotiations with the Kiev regime in Istanbul, Belarus, and then Istanbul back in 2022, right? This is clearly indicating, and Russia has said it outright, that they view this as a return to and a continuation of the Istanbul process. So that's why they said Istanbul. That's why they sent Medinsky. In fact, in Istanbul, they requested from Erdogan the same palace and supposedly even the very same room. Meanwhile, the Kiev regime is trying to completely say, oh, there's nothing in common, right? There's no continuation. And the reason Russia's doing this is one, to point out that they have always been up for negotiation and diplomacy to meet their goals, right? And that it was the Kiev regime that walked away from Istanbul in 2022. But they're also indicating that the Istanbul Commune is the minimum, right? That's the basis for negotiations. But they were also quite clear that that was the basis then, but this is 2025, not 2022. There's a lot more facts on the ground that have to be taken into account, i.e. we're in a much better position and you're in a much worse position than then. The other members of the team, very professional, a deputy foreign minister, a deputy defense minister, lots of top military officials, lots of policy experts. This is a serious, classical Russian, Soviet, very strong, very well prepared negotiation team. In fact, the briefing that they got before they went was with not only Putin, but the entirety of the Russian Security Council and ministers from across the government and the commanders of each area group of the SMO in Ukraine, Force Center, Force North, Force South, all of those were there as well. This was very serious. Russia is taking this seriously, and they were also making it thus known to the United States that they're taking these negotiations very seriously. Zelensky didn't want serious negotiations. He didn't want negotiations at all. Didn't want to go. And if he was going to go, then he wanted a grandstanding PR affair where he would attack Putin, something like that. It wouldn't have resulted in anything, but that he thinks he could have won a kind of presentation victory over Putin. And Russia simply wasn't going to walk into that trap, wasn't going to play that game. So they said negotiations, they sent a negotiating team. And Thursday, the Russian team was there, twiddling their thumbs, and the hours passed. Now, this is where we get this interesting game of musical cities in Turkey, because the Russians are in Istanbul, where they said they would be, right? In the very same room where negotiations left off in 2022. Meanwhile, Zelensky, for some reason, showed up, but not in Istanbul. Him and all of his people went to Ankara, to the Turkish capital, where they were in some type of private cahoots and plotting with Erdogan, the cunning beast, right? You know, the neo-Ottoman Sultan himself. And supposedly Zelensky was in conversation with him for hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, something like that. And I got to hand it off, salute, hat tip. Anyone who could put up with Zelensky's whining for hours on end, right? That's endurance. I didn't think Erdogan at his age and reported health was capable of enduring Zelensky for that long. But meanwhile, the Europeans and the Americans were also there, but they weren't in Istanbul and they weren't in Ankara. They were in Antalya, which is a resort city on the coast. And supposedly, just coincidentally, there was a NATO meeting there. So Rubio was there, lots of top, Starmer was there, Macron was there, Merz was there. Even for some reason, the fire-breathing anti-Russian neocon Senator Lindsey Graham was there, because I guess he needed to loom over the background of this whole thing, screaming about sanctions against Russia, right? So this went on Thursday, and the Ukrainians never showed up. And it was only around midnight that they finally said, all right, we'll send a team. They'll be there tomorrow, right? So the Russians are like, okay, all right, we'll wait. We're professionals. We'll sit. And even the next day, on Friday, right, going to recording, the Russians had to wait for hours before the Ukrainian team finally came in. The Ukrainian team is a political team, right? They're not a serious negotiation team. It included their defense minister, Rustem Umarov, their foreign minister, Sabiga, and others. These are not people who have the time, right, or the focus to spend hours, grueling, repetitively grueling through details of negotiations and things like this. These are the type of people that give the parameters and sign off on things at the end before it's presented to your leader, right? They're not a negotiation team. Again, it's a political team. It's about presentation. It's not about serious negotiations. So reportedly, the negotiations went on for somewhat less than 2 hours. Right, the Ukrainians, the Kiev regime insisted that they were only there to discuss Russia accepting a 30-day ceasefire and nothing else. Russia insisted they were going into these talks to begin the process of addressing the core issues of this conflict. Right. So what actually happened, I guess, ended up the topic of conversation, from what we know, went the Ukrainian way. They did discuss a ceasefire, right? In that Russia said only under these conditions, right? And, they reiterated the West must stop all military and intelligence aid to Ukraine, but they also once again made clear that the Kiev regime must withdraw all their troops from Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and from these 4 oblasts. And the Kiev regime obviously said no in a pig's eye, right? That's not happening. Now, the initial reports coming out from the Ukrainian side, they reported shocked that the Russian team had stood up at that point. And Medinsky said, fine, you don't agree to withdrawing from those 4 oblasts. The next time we meet, it will be 5, right? And so that was, unconfirmed. Well, the head of Rossiya Savonia, the parent company of RT and Sputnik, Margarita Semenyan, right? Very, close to the administration and very patriotic about this conflict, it must be said. She said that her journalist on the ground in Istanbul talked to the Russian team, and they said that's not the way it went. That's not what we said. They said we didn't say 5 oblasts. We said 8. Boom, mic drop, right? So coming from Semyon, I have to lend that some more credibility than we heard earlier. So the Russians were not in a, they were hardcore. They were hardcore. Now, the other things that they did discuss, they said that, so what was concluded in those 2 hours is they both agreed that they would present a detailed list of their demands for a ceasefire. All right, well, that's a dead end, right? Because we know that the Kiev is never going to meet Russia's demands for a ceasefire, and then Russia will say, "Okay, well, we don't want a ceasefire anyway. You don't meet our demands," and then the conflict will continue. If you want to keep talking, we'll be glad to keep talking, but we're going to continue to increase the battlefield pressure because that's leverage for us. We're creating new facts on the ground every day. Sometimes it's a tree line a day, right, in some directions, and a trench. In other places, it's settlements, right, a dozen or so towns, small cities. And it has to be said, while it's still a war of attrition, it's a war of attrition that is ever increasingly leaning in Russia's favor. And the war of attrition is moving faster, much faster than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. So new facts on the ground every day. Russia's happy to keep that up. The other things that they talked about were a POW exchange, right? A substantial one. They're talking about 1,000 for 1,000. That would be the biggest POW exchange so far. That's good, right? That's good. Now here's the thing. The Kiev regime keeps pushing for an all-for-all prisoner exchange, which Russia has somewhere between 5 and 10 times as many Kiev regime POWs as the other way around. So they're never going to agree to that, right? What's more is the Russian government this week accused the Kiev regime that they hold Russian civilians captured in Kursk, and they are trying to trade them for the Kiev regime's Azov neo-Nazis, right? And that would be a war crime. Right, you're trying to trade civilians as holding them and trying to trade them for military troops. That's a war crime. So that didn't come about today, but it was announced earlier in the week. So a substantial prisoner of war exchange was arranged, and they both seem to agree that there is the potential that they would begin a next round of negotiations, right? Although that was not announced. So here's an accomplishment. And the Russian side kind of buttering up Trump a bit, but it's also true that he has essentially pushed Zelensky to the grindstone and forced the European patrons to accept direct negotiations, which the Kiev regime had never accepted. Right. In fact, that diktat of Zelensky's hasn't gone away. Who knows? Right. No, just being ignored. But the Russian side buttering up Trump's buttocks said no one but Trump could have accomplished this. Right. It's kind of, to a lesser degree. Right. At least we're there. So, I mean, negotiations are a good thing, even if they don't come to anything, and they don't come to a diplomatic settlement, right? They're forced to engage Russia diplomatically, right? Even if the U.S. is forcing them to this. Now, I don't expect, and no one expects these settlements to go anywhere. But now in the background, Trump is going off saying nothing will be solved in this conflict until I meet Vladimir Vladimirovich personally. Right? If I can just meet him, if I can just talk to him in a smoke-filled room, we can shake hands and I can look him in the eye and I can make whatever mafia threats. I'll break your leg and burn down your cousin's house, or, whatever kind of threats that Trump is used to making going into negotiations, like with Iran, with his art of the deal. I'll bomb you, blah, 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 whatever. He's obsessed with meeting Putin. Right. And Russia's like, sure, absolutely. We want to meet Putin and Trump to meet when the time is right. when the proper preparations have been made, when there have been substantial progress in negotiations, in the conflict in Ukraine, in improving bilateral relations, whatever. That has to be a process, right? The two leaders of the two countries just don't meet. We're essentially in a state of conflict, whether you want to admit it now. I mean, Marco Rubio did say that the whole thing was a proxy war against Russia, but Trump administration is trying to present itself as some type of third party mediator or arbiter of this whole thing, even though they now think that they can settle it if Trump can just meet with Putin, which seems to kind of go against that argument, right? Shouldn't Russia be negotiating with Ukraine? But we all know that's not going to go anywhere. So things are, this clown show continues, right? Trump is demanding a personal meeting with Putin. Going to recording, the Russians are still putting him off because they, again, this is something that should occur at the end of a process, right? When there's something for them to actually discuss. They don't want this pressure meeting where Putin has to say no personally to Trump, right? Because that would definitely, I think, shift Trump into the blame Russia camp for this whole thing. And again, Russia, even if they know that it's probably going to end with them taking the blame for it, they're still going to make a good faith effort of going through the process and hoping at least that Trump instead blames Zelensky or the Europeans or both for this whole thing. So this is a clown show. It's not going to go anywhere. You want to call it a nothing burger, whatever. It's a game of diplomatic maneuver, of hot potato. Meanwhile, the real story is what's going on the battlefield, even though no one is talking about it. In fact, we're not even talking about it, right? We're talking about this farcical theater of the absurd going on, in Turkey. But Russia, the Kiev regime is not successfully defending almost anywhere on the battlefield right now. Russian forces are advancing everywhere. And I'm telling you right now, the big Russian offensive is to come. That's going to come early summer, sometime this summer at least. And there is the possibility that Russia, well, we know it's not a possibility. The Wall Street Journal reported in the last week that Russia has 2 entire armies being held in reserve, right? Of volunteer contract soldiers for the SMO, right? We're not talking regular troops or people doing their 1 year of military service. No, this is professionals, contract soldiers who signed up, 2 entire armies kitted out with better gear than what, newer tanks, better stuff that is actually being used on the front right now, according to the Wall Street Journal, quoting U.S. intelligence, right? So that's some 240,000 troops on top of the 600 to 800,000, take your pick, that is already engaged in the SMO. Now, some people say that's there for a deterrent against NATO direct intervention, but at some point, it's obvious that NATO doesn't really present a significant threat. And I think it's likely that those forces, at least a large amount of them, will be part of a major new crippling Russian offensive that will come later this year. I think that there will be a push for Russia to break out of the war of attrition sometime in the coming months to make big gains, because there's a drive now for a political endgame. Well, Russia is putting that off and creating many more facts on the ground. Putin suggested to troops, to naval troops, earlier, a couple of months ago, just over a month ago, that the Russian military thinks that it could collapse, right? That they could bring the war to a quicker conclusion sometime later this year. Now, I don't know about that. One of the things that the Economist, anti-Russian British news mag of record, right? their longtime anti-Russian reporter Oliver Carroll is reporting another thing that the Russians supposedly said to the Kiev regime team during these less than 2 hours of negotiations in Istanbul when it finally occurred. That they said, look, we don't want this war to continue, but if you don't agree to our terms, then we'll keep fighting for another year, another 2 years, another 3 years, however long it takes, right? And this was from Medinsky. And he said, Medinsky, among other things, right? A Duma, he was a member of the Duma, the Russian parliament. He was also Minister of Culture. He's also an academic and a military historian. And then he said, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we fought Sweden for 21 years. How long are you willing and able to continue this conflict, right? So again, Russia being very hardcore, smack talking to the Ukrainians, not taking anything. They're being right up in front about where this is going unless you agree to our terms now. So I think that's, again, whether you want to believe that or not, that's what The Economist is reporting. And it does seem to mesh with a lot of other things that we have heard. So Russia is making no concessions. They're not giving any ground. They're not conceding to Western demands for a ceasefire. They're not giving anything up to the Kiev regime in negotiations. In fact, every indication is they are demanding more than ever before, reflective of their strength on the battlefield and the bad position of the Kiev regime and its European backers. It was just this week that Macron announced that France is tapped out. They don't have anything left to send the Kiev regime. The UK has earlier made the same announcement, as has the Germans and others. They keep saying that, keep scrambling up some other stuff, but they cannot sustain this conflict. Certainly not replace the U.S. Unless Trump returns to new weapons packages. There's still U.S. arms flowing to Ukraine, right? These long-term contracts that Biden made, right? As things are produced by the military-industrial complex, artillery shells and the like, they're automatically going to Ukraine. Those continue, right? But Trump has signed off on no new major arm packages. However, in the last 3 weeks, he has agreed on some new weapons agreements for Ukraine. They're not being billed as him giving the money. They're being billed as the Kiev regime paying for them.
European. You mean Europeans pay for them?
Yeah, well, that's what it is, right? Because the Kiev regime has no money of their own, so it's either U.S. money or Europeans, and supposedly that money is Europeans now. But that's probably where Trump is going to go, right? That's where he will be forced to. He'll provide arms. The Europeans will simply pay for them now, right? That's where he'll be able to say, well, I'm not giving him any weapons, right? That's the important thing. But that's where we're likely to see this go, simply because the U.S. Trump is in a bad position. He's got too much pressure on him to not agree to Russia's terms, and he's going to have to follow Brandon 2.0. He's going to have to resume arms supplies. He'll just have to find a way to spin it. Interestingly, a part of the minerals deal, the investment fund, right, what we've been able to see, because only a third of it has actually been made public, is that U.S. military aid to the Kiev regime, to Ukraine, will be considered part of American investment, right, under the terms of that deal. So that seems to also create another potential avenue for, I'm not giving military aid to Ukraine. I'm simply investing in their economy, right? That's kind of, I can see those justifications coming down the road when this whole diplomatic thing goes into the weeds, at least for a few more months or years or however long it takes for the Kiev regime to surrender. And if they never do, well, then, on to Kiev and Lvov, if that's what it takes, however long it takes. Russia is prepared for it. Russia right now, military recruitment. Russia has been getting, even the Western media has admitted this, some 30 to 40,000 people signing up to serve specifically in the SMO, volunteer contract soldiers, not forced conscripts dragged like dogs off the street, as Putin pointed out, right? Like the Kiev regime is fighting with. But professional contract soldiers, 30 to 40,000 every month. But in recent months, that number, according to Putin, has gone through the roof, right? He says that it's now 50 to 60,000. And here in Moscow, this is something I see, particularly in the run up to Victory Day, right? In the last few months, Russian support for the SMO is not declining, it's going up, right? I don't even know if it's at a peak or if it's still increasing. But Russian society is completely behind this, right? Even more than before. They sent victory, right? What's more, what I hear from people, I know people who have volunteered, right? Not well, but I've have family who have spoken to them, right? Just recently, not just young guys, right? 40 something year old guys, right? Professionals, right? In white collar jobs. They're saying, I don't feel that I've done anything important in my life. And this is the mission of our generation. Like our grandfathers fought in World War II, right? We're fighting a resurgence of the Nazi collaborators, the Banderite fascists in Ukraine, and all of NATO. I want to be part of that. I want to do my part, right? And with all the run up to the 80th anniversary of victory and all of that, there's just been an explosion of enlistment, right? So the Russian military keeps getting bigger and bigger in a big way, right? Of people who believe in what they're doing, right? People who are undergoing a year or more of training before they are eventually put into the conflict. While the Kiev regime can't even forcibly conscript enough people, right, off the streets, forcing them directly into the trenches, with no training, enough to meet even their losses on the battlefield, right? Not even coming any close to it, by all accounts. So the math, just again, a war of attrition is about math. It's about logistics. It's about manpower. And eventually, yes, it will reach a tipping point and we'll start to see more generalized crumbling, right? Even if there's not ever a total collapse. I think the point is coming close. And particularly if the U.S. doesn't resume arms supplies in the next few months, that big influx of arms that Biden sent to the Kiev regime just before he got out of office will have been depleted. And then Trump will either be forced to rapidly increase those arms under whatever terms, or it's going to really start to tell on the battlefield. And we've had the Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, the genocidal maniac Kyrylo, I like the dark Budanov, say that to the Kiev regime's Rada in closed session, according to Ukrainian media outlets. So, that's where everything's heading. All of this Istanbul show that, we've all got to talk about because that's all that the newspapers are talking about, the media is talking about. But all of that is some sideshow carnival, some theater of the absurd. The real story is on the battleground every day, and the math and the facts on the ground ever more in Russia's direction, which is why all of this desperation and panic and hysteria that you're hearing from European leaders right now.
Mark, it seems that on the part of Russians, they don't see what they have expected from Donald Trump and his administration. They're simply incapable of convincing Europe and Zelensky. And in my opinion, that's why Russians have decided to change their position toward the government in Kiev, to talk with them, to negotiate, to directly negotiate with them, because they see Donald Trump incapable, simply incapable of communicating with Zelensky and Europeans. And he's weakening his position toward Europe. You look at the tariffs, you look at his moves toward Europe. He's not making that sort of connection that is capable to convince them. But even he's not putting pressure on them. Zelensky, what did he do with Zelensky? He's just making a discussion on camera. What was the outcome of that?
So, first of all, it has to be said that in Russia, if we're talking about the Russian people, yeah, I think the media to a certain extent kind of ran with Trump hopes, right? Which I think I've been pretty consistent in saying that there was no Trump hopes, for months now. But I think even Russian media just so happy to hear anyone in the U.S., much less the guy who became president, speak in terms that were made more sense to them, and there was the hope that Trump would end this on Russia's terms, that he would understand the realities on the ground and react to them in a way that Biden didn't clearly, or Blinken and Sullivan anyway. We don't want to speak of the corpse, but yeah, I think that honeymoon phases of the Russian media and public, with the hopes that Trump would do things differently, is quickly fading. We're talking the Russian government. I think they're again, this is a game of diplomatic maneuver. They're tacking to the prevailing wind. If you remember, when Russia and the U.S. started to meet in Riyadh, it was all initially about Russia and the U.S. meeting together, alone, improving bilateral relations, right? That has already itself gone into the weeds and doesn't appear to be making any progress, because the U.S. is upset that they're not getting what they want on the Ukraine. Russia is perfectly, in fact, what they would prefer is that there's two separate tracks of negotiation with the U.S. that only have slight overlap. One, a general improvement of bilateral relations, and all of the other things that the U.S. and Russia should be negotiating with around the world, all the other, conflicts and problems, and the conflict in Ukraine, and that one should not be dependent, on the other. So first, they pushed this U.S. and Russia. Then they sensed that they weren't making any more progress in that, and Trump began talking up direct Russian and Ukrainian negotiations. Then they tacked that way, not because they actually believe that there's any capability of making progress with the Kiev regime. They don't, right? They still, I think everything they're doing on the ground, preparing for a major, new offensive this summer, tells me that they don't believe that negotiations with the U.S., with Trump, are going to achieve anything either. But that's still the target right now. That's still, on the diplomatic front. Even when they're talking to Ukraine, they're not talking to the Kiev regime. They're signaling to Trump. This is still all about what's going on, if anything, within Trump's head, right? They don't seriously believe that they can come to any diplomatic settlement with the Maidan regime, Zelensky and his crew, or anyone else in Ukraine. This is diplomatic maneuver. It's a dance.
Mark, how did you find Donald Trump's visit to the Middle East? And the case of Iran right now, you look at the Fox News, it's the same sort of story that you've been mentioning about. You remember when he came to power, he said that he's going to put an end. He's going to, as you've mentioned with the case of Ukraine, I do feel that with the case of Iran would be the same, that they're just making noises and it's something big going to come and nothing would happen after all.
Yeah. You see the lengths that the Biden administration went to avoid war with Iran even as Netanyahu pushed very hard to try to make the U.S. go to war with Iran. It went to the extent that the U.S. and Iran were negotiating through intermediaries in Oman and elsewhere, supposedly. But they did pantomime attacks, choreographed attacks, face-saving attacks for Iran on prearranged targets where the U.S. would attempt to shoot down missiles, but they weren't really being aimed at anything. Everyone would declare victory and go away, right? This happened on 2 occasions, right? The same thing with the Trump administration, right? I believe that the Trump administration doesn't want a conflict in Iran, in the Middle East, right? Doesn't mean that they don't want war with Iran, but just not now, right? They've got other priorities. They want to finish up this Ukraine thing if they can, and they want to pivot to what they see as the real problem, a war they can't win against China in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. But every U.S. president since Obama has been trying to make that pivot, and it never. They
Mark,
always
by
get
the
caught
way,
up in the Middle East, and now with
Mark, Reuters reported just moments ago reported that the United States wants to withdraw troops from Europe after NATO summit, and as you mentioned, it's that they want to just pivot toward the Pacific. But
Asia.
go ahead,
Yeah,
and how successful
yeah.
that would be under the Trump.
I don't expect they'll have much success in that, to be perfectly honest. The Middle East is not going to go away. I think that they're trying to bluff and bluster, right? They're making increasingly absurd demands right now in the last 2 weeks, right? That demand that Iran give up its entire civilian nuclear program so that they're not enriching anything, something they're entitled to do under international law and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, by the way, which Iran will never agree to. They're a sovereign country. They're also demanding that the Iran give up all support for any Shiite groups through the Middle East, i.e., the axis of resistance, right? Because the U.S. is allowed to arm proxies, but not Iran, right? That's the way the deal shakes. But I think this is still largely bluff and bluster, trying to make absurd demands about before going into negotiations that they will then walk down from. Right? All this threats about bombing Iran. At the end of the day, right, what is most likely going to come out of this is a JCPOA 2.0 rebranded with Trump, right? Trump approved branding, probably some tacky gold lame finish on it because Trump seems to love that stuff, right? It'll be better for the U.S. than the original JCPOA ever was, right? And what has convinced me of that is the U.S. just is not militarily prepared to go to war with Iran, not unless they were willing to sacrifice all of their commitments, their pivot to China, everything else. The U.S. has a critical Achilles heel shortage in air defense missiles, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but also important in long-range strike missiles, right? They already had a shortage of Patriot interceptors before the conflict in Ukraine started, back when they were supplying Saudi Arabia. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, right? The U.S. was actually making other Middle East countries provide their Patriot interceptors to Saudis when they were attempting to stop the Houthis, on Salah, from hitting their airports, their energy infrastructure, their pipelines, and the like. U.S. was already short. They don't make enough Patriot interceptors to meet their demands, right? And they haven't been able to successfully ramp up production of them. So everything they've expended in Ukraine has made things worse. Everything they've done for the last 2 months, playing whack-a-mole against the Houthis in Yemen, right? More and more air defense missiles and strike missiles wasted, over 1,000 airstrikes. To what effect, right? This is why Trump tried to declare victory. The Houthis have capitulated, and he dragged the U.S. Navy out of the Red Sea while the Houthis continue making missile strikes on Israel, right? because they just realize they can't maintain it. And what's more, the New York Times revealed in the last week that the U.S. failed to achieve air superiority over Yemen, the poorest by many standards country in the world, right? They say that even one of their F-35s was successfully identified and targeted. The missile failed to hit, but that it could have been hit, right? One of their great fabled, boondoggle invisible F-35s. And they lost two F-18s, if you'll remember, off their aircraft carriers, supposedly, right? That's why they tuck tails and run. If the U.S. can't achieve air superiority over Yemen, how are they supposed to conduct a major air and missile campaign against Iran, which has much more significant Russia is building. It's going to take a while, but they've already been laying the groundwork, right? They already have S-300s there. Iran has much more formidable air defense capabilities already, and it's increasing, over time. And they have much more formidable long-range strike capabilities, missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, supposedly hypersonic missiles, drones. We've seen them used, to a choreographed extent in Israel twice already now. The U.S. can't defend against that. They can't defend all of Israel. They can't defend all of their military bases throughout the Middle East. They don't have enough air defense missiles. They don't have enough long-range strike capability. This is why I'm convinced that what we're hearing from the Trump administration on Iran is bluff. It's bluster. It's a negotiation tactic going in, making absurd demands high, but they don't really want a conflict. There are people, must be said, within the administration that do want war with Iran. But I think Trump and other key decision makers, Vance and others, do not. And that might be at least part of the reason why Waltz was moved out of National Security Advisor. Because, yes, IPAC, the lobby, is pushing very hard. Netanyahu obviously wants it. I believe what the Trump administration is telling Netanyahu is, we'll give you anything you want. We'll give you whatever weapons you want. We'll let you do anything to the Palestinians you want, which they're being perfectly clear. They're being completely open. We're going to ethnically cleanse Palestine, starting with Gaza, but not ending there, of the Palestinians. And Trump just gave a green light for that, right? He absolutely perfectly okay with him. He'll build a resort on the ashes, right? That's the type of real estate he was talking. You can do whatever you want to the Palestinians, but we're not prepared to go to war with Iran right now. And Netanyahu is evidently in a bit of a tiff about that, right? There's a little bit of a supposedly there's a little bit of a lovers quarrel going on with Trump and Netanyahu that won't come to anything in the long term. U.S. Israeli relations are too wedded together. But Trump's trip to the Middle East, right? He tried to avoid the whole Israel thing. This is a return to safe territory. Right. He went there, if you'll remember, during his first administration, to a lot of praise and fanfare. There was this weird picture of him and MBS and Al-Sisi touching some type of globe. It was like Saruman, Lord of the Rings, Palantir stuff. It was very weird. But he knows when he goes to the Middle East, he's going to be met with the pomp, the circumstance, right? The adulation that he expects. That's why he made this his first major overseas trip. They threw money at him. I just see Trump as have you ever been to a strip club, Nima? No? Are you serious?
Never,
Yeah. Okay.
never.
All right. So, but you've seen the movies, right? These throwing dollars, right, up at the girl on the pole and everything. This was the Arab leaders at Trump, right, during this trip, throwing money at him. The Saudis promised 600 billion. The Emiratis are, no, we'll give 1.4 trillion over 10 years investment in the U.S. economy. And then the Qataris are like, yeah, well, here's a luxury 747 parked right here, right? This is what this trip was about. Trump was in comfortable territory, money just being thrown at him by the Arab leaders who are confident that, that with the flattery, that, feeding to, Trump's ego and narcissism, that they'll be on good terms with him, at least for the next couple of years. There was absolutely no move, nothing serious discussed about Palestine, about Israel, about Iran. None of that was topic, right? Yes, Trump would like the Abraham Accords, right? This idea of Saudi and Israel normalizing relations. Saudis made perfectly clear that's not going to happen, I think, until Palestinian statehood is recognized, which is not on the cards. So they were basically buying off Trump. Yeah, we're not going to give you the Abraham Accords, but here's money and praise and red carpets and all the adulation that is due the God Emperor of America or mankind or whatever. And so that's all that this trip really was, right? There wasn't anything concrete or strategic or geopolitical that really came out of it. It's a Trump feel good and collect money tour.
Mark, was so somehow surprising that Donald Trump, together with Al Jolani and MBS, they gathered and they were talking about the situation in Syria, and Donald Trump promised to lift all the sanctions in Syria. It's so amazing how they can change their attitude and just
No, it's not. I mean, they were supporting jihadists for years. You know that, Nima. Now it's just all in the open, right? Notice Al Jolani, right? Or Al Shad, or whatever they want to call him now, right? He was literally the leader of both Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Nusra in Syria. And before that, he was the leader of ISIS in Syria, right? The Syrian branch of ISIS. And this guy, who evidently personally beheaded people, right, is now presented as the president of Syria. And everyone, Macron, Trump, they're all posing with him. Trump, he's a handsome guy. He's a young guy. He's a fighter. He's strong. He's a jihadist. He's a terrorist, whom until last week was a wanted terrorist with the U.S. State Department having a $10 million bounty on his head. His group, right, is still recognized. HTS is recognized as a terrorist group in the US, in the UK, in the EU, at the UN, and everyone pretends that it's something different. It is absolutely Orwellian. Not one journalist, not one Western journalist confronts Trump or Starmer or Macron or any of these people. Hey, wasn't this guy the leader of Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Isn't he a wanted terrorist? No one says that. Right? No one asks the question. It's this game of I don't know, look the other way, make believe. It's sickening. It is obscene. Out of anything, right? This spectacle of Trump embracing him, right? Of Macron embracing him, it is the most morally bankrupt. I don't like speaking in moral terms, right? I'm a realist. I like real politics. I'm sorry. This was evil. This was evil. There is right now a genocide of Alawites and Christians and other minorities in Syria, and even Sunnis who don't agree with the Wahhabist Salafist, dominant regime and its jihadi forces in the country. It's still ongoing. I mean, just the press doesn't talk about it. I watched enough videos, heard enough things. It's heartbreaking. It's horrific. I had myself in tears. I don't know what to. I mean, it was always inevitable once the Syrian government fell, but it seriously has broken me. I know that there's still thousands of Alawites sheltering in the Russian military bases that are still in Syria. Anyone in the Russian government, or if you're ever listening to this out here, please, for God's sakes, offer Russian citizenship to all the Alawites, all the Christians in Syria, offer to get them out, right? Whatever, and give them a safe place to live. Russia's done that sort of thing before with lots of Christian minorities historically, Greek communities, from Turkey and elsewhere. And this is, take this, what happened in Syria, as a lesson learned, and to never take your eye off the ball or to trust Turkey or the West or anything, because Russia won the war in Syria on the battlefield, and they lost the peace, and they lost it catastrophically. And yes, there's lots of blame to go around. Russia, Iran both took their eye off the ball. Assad was a weak leader. The U.S. sanctions hollowed out the economy. Turkish intelligence penetrated the military and the political authorities, and they sold out and they co-opted and they ordered their troops to stand down, right? But it was a catastrophic loss. And what's going on now, Al-Qaeda being presented as the leader, the president of a country. I saw a BBC article that actually claimed that he was elected. And no word of lie. He was elected by who and what election? I was just absolutely amazed by that. I can't believe the BBC. I mean, I know it's propaganda, but usually they're a little more less obvious about their outright lies than that. It's sickening. It's obscene, Nima. I don't know what else to tell you. It turns my stomach. That's why right now I have to look away from Syria, because it's just a pit of despair. It's a pit of loss. It's a pit of guilt. And at least and it has to be said, Ukraine is an existential. It's far more important to Russia's national interests, its security, its but in geopolitical terms, what happened in Syria was still a big, horrible L, with the consequences that will be played out for the poor people of Syria and the region, going forward.
Mark, to wrap up this session, do you find the sort of, how we can say, somehow they are competing, their egos are competing each other, Netanyahu and Donald Trump?
Sure. Yeah, they're two alpha dogs, right? Of course. And Netanyahu is used to running all over Biden and going to the U.S. Congress and being feted there, even with Biden and Trump. Biden and Netanyahu had their difficulty. They didn't get along, right? So yeah, there might be a personal, tiff going on between Trump and Netanyahu. They're both alpha dogs, but ultimately it doesn't really make any difference. Even if they don't patch things in their lovers' quarrel, who cares if Donald Trump is on, or Netanyahu is on the couch tonight or something? U.S. and Israeli foreign policy and geopolitics are so intertwined that bad personal relations between Biden or whoever was running his administration and Netanyahu didn't restrict, in any conceivable way. Yes, Biden didn't send 2,000-pound bombs to Netanyahu. Well, Trump already did that. That's the extent. Nothing is going to change or can change, right? Between America's Israel first policy. It will continue. I've never completely understood it myself. Mearsheimer and Walt's seminal book, The Israeli Lobby, everyone should read that book who wants to learn more. That provides some level of illumination, at least to the pernicious influence of Israel on U.S. foreign policy. But really, it's it's symbiotic, or it's circular. They feed each other, right? They're two heads of the same beast for all intents and purposes. And if Trump and Netanyahu are having a little lover spat it's not going to matter or change things in any conceivable way.
But if we assume that Donald Trump, as he did with China, he just attacked China with tariffs, and he decided to somehow back down and negotiate, talk with China. With the case of Yemen, it seems the same sort of strategy. He attacked, he saw that he was not able to do a substantial change in the attitude of the Yemenis, and he right now he decided to get out of the Red Sea somehow. Not totally, but when it comes to Israel, do you think Israel can continue this sort of conflict that they're in any front? You look at Israel, they're attacking each and everybody in that region without the United States. If the United States under the Trump administration decides to continue
Yeah.
with the same manner that they did in Yemen, I do believe that Netanyahu is not capable of continuing this sort of strategy on his part.
I think again, Trump is going to say, "Do whatever you want to Palestine. I'm not going to get involved in a war." Israel will keep pushing for war with Iran, but they'll happily finish off the Palestinians. Right? That's something that they're going to move on, and they will have at least tacit U.S. support for. And I think Netanyahu can easily stay in power with that. I don't think that there's any serious challenge. And
But if
Russia
Yemen,
recognized.
Mark, if Yemen decides to hit Israel harder and with a lot of missiles, how is that going to bring
Okay,
some sort of changes to
it's
the
not.
equation?
It's not. Yemen has very limited. I mean, every time, right? You can take a bit of moral, you know, hope, or good feeling every time Yemen launch, but they have very limited capability. They're a long distance. They're not a wealthy country. What they're doing is heroic, right, in a certain sense, and they're the only country, or if you recognize them as the government of Yemen, are not doing something actively against the ongoing genocide of Palestinians, but they don't have that capability. Right? They can be an annoyance. They can cause some small problems, maybe. But what we've seen is 8 or 9 times out of 10, they don't even manage to hit anything. Let's be honest about that. It's more the moral act of making a strike against Israel. They can't seriously impede that process. No one can. No one can. The one possibility, the one player in the region who had the capability and or at least theoretically the capability and the will to do something was Syria, and they're gone. Right. So I very much feel for the Palestinian people, but let's be honest, they're doomed. Right. China and Russia, their geopolitical horizon does not extend into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No one, South Africa, yes, is trying to make a moral case, and you see where that's going, right? Nowhere in the International Court of Justice, right? U.S. has effectively, in the West, have effectively, at least put that whole thing on pause and whatever. Palestinian people are unfortunately, and however ironically, doomed to become a nomadic people without even a home, much less a state, much like the Jews once were. And it may if not probably not in its entirety, but I'm pretty sure that at the very least, we're going to see Gaza cleansed, right? They'll be driven into wherever, right? I know Egypt and Jordan don't want to open their borders, but there will be huge pressure on them to do so. And let's be honest, they're waging a starvation campaign against the Palestinians right now, right? I mean, it's horrific, and it's not going to get any better you can't even foresee a future where it's going to get better, because no change of U.S. presidency is going to result in a different U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And no one else can do anything about it, right? in a multipolar world future, we can hope that something like that wouldn't happen, but we're not there. We're not anywhere even close to there yet. The hegemon still has large sway over large swaths of the world, and Israel Palestine is one of them. I don't have any. I mean, I don't do hope, but I certainly don't have any hope for the Palestinians. They just have my, what can I say? It's not worth anything, but they have my sympathy.
Do you think behind the scene Donald Trump was talking about Palestinians with Al Jolani, and you talk
No.
about Jordan and don't?
No, I don't think Trump ever does anything complicated like that, and I don't think that was brought up at all.
Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.